Ever since the G80 M3 has came out, the BMW community has been a broken record about just how ugly its front grills are. Newsflash, every generation of M car has rubbed fans the wrong way. BMW changes their formula each and every time they release a car. With the G80 M3, it seems everyone has forgotten about these oh so controversial things that the F80 M3 came with when it first arrived in 2015. In case you forgot, here's 5 reasons why you need to stop harping on the G80 M3, because this car right here was not perfect. Let's dive into it. So for the first thing that everybody hated about the F80 M3, we have to talk about the electronic steering and its handling characteristics. Now, there's no doubt that the F80 M3 was an amazing performer, but it came at the cost of a true connection with the car. Everybody raved about how the E90X and the E46 generations with their hydraulic steering racks were far superior in connection than the F80 M3 ever was. And that's a really important thing to consider when you're driving a sports car. And going more into the handling characteristics, as I drive through these horrible Salem, Massachusetts roads where there's a pothole pretty much every 2 feet, I see that compromise that this car's suspension had to make to increase the track performance. Now, I've never driven an E90X or E46 generation car, but boy, it cannot be as rough and as jarring as the F80 is. Correct me if I'm wrong. So for the second thing that people hated about the F80, that basically was its size and its weight. Compared to all the previous generations of the M3, this was by far the biggest. The E90X was very small, the E46 was even smaller, and then you had the E36 and then the E30, which was basically just a tiny box. This car felt more like a grand tourer, and people could certainly feel it when they drove the car, and that's not idealistic of an M car. People want a car that feels small, feels easy to maneuver, and so on and so forth. And people hated that about this car. So for the third thing that people hated about the F80 was not these exhaust tips, because these exhaust tips are actually pretty cool, but the noise that is coming out of these exhaust tips. People hated the way that this car sounded when it was released, because they had moved from the S55 V8 engine to the S55 engine, which was an inline six with twin turbos. It completely transformed the sound of the car and completely transformed the way that the car made you feel. Sound is so important to the way it makes you feel, right? And it sounded more like a Chevy Colorado than a German sports car once they did that. I personally am not a fan of this metallic sound that the car makes, and I'm sure a lot of people agree with me, even F80 M3 owners themselves. And since we're talking about that note that comes out of the back of the F80 M3, we might as well talk about what they did that really ticked people off for the fourth thing, the S55 engine. Never before had the M car used a forced induction engine. It had always been naturally aspirated. People thought the V8 was weird, but you know, at least it sounded good. This changed the way that M cars feel. It gave it a very spiky, power band, and many people complained about it because it gave this car more Mustang characteristics than a German car. And great, I love that you can mod the crap out of this car and you can give this thing like 700 horsepower, but it was a stray away from what BMW M3 fans had seen in the past, and it rubbed a lot of people in the wrong way. And for the fifth thing that everybody hated about the F80 M3, I have to just talk about how BMW basically sold themselves out. The F80 M3 was the most advanced M car to date. It did everything perfectly. So many reviewers talk about how the car is so perfect, but essentially it has no soul. If you haven't seen Savage Geese's review on the F80 M3, it explains exactly what I'm talking about. This car was a track machine. It handled well. It was an amazing daily driver. There was nothing wrong with it. And a lot of us enthusiasts, we want our cars to have some sort of contention point, and this car had none. Because this car was so perfect, it made it hard to have a true connection with it, not just because of the electronic steering or the sound or any of those things that I talked about before, but nonetheless, people still loved it, even though it was a far cry from what BMW had always done in the past. What's so crazy about all of this is all the problems that I mentioned about this car earlier, they all just began to fade away. People stopped caring about the S55 sound because they knew how much more powerful it was than the E90X generation. No one cared about the increased size because it was deemed more practical and usable. What's interesting is it seems that no matter what BMW does, we all fall in line with it. The E90X generation had a V8 engine. The F80 had forced induction inline 6. It's almost as if BMW knows what's best for us even when we don't. And with the recent G80X version, it seems like they believe giant grills are what BMW M fans need. And if that's what they are telling us we need, then I guess I have no choice but to go out and pick up a G80 M3. And in case you're wondering, that's the shameless plug to the fact that I will be buying a G80 M3. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.